Yeah, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the connected device oversight. Um, and so my name is Mark. I lead the engineering team at Marcus Engineering. So we do lots of embedded security. We produce embedded connected products. We work in a number of fields, primarily medical, but also industrial, aerospace, consumer, those kinds of fields. And so I'm not the Mark in Marcus Engineering. That's my boss, Patrick Marcus. So today we're going to talk about connected devices. And so the first thing that we're going to talk about is what is a connected device? And the FDA has a really broad view of what connected devices are. And so today we're talking about devices, they have Bluetooth, they have Wi-Fi, they have Ethernet, or they're connected to a server, or they're connected to a record system or EHR, they're connected to a hospital network, or they're connected to anything outside of themselves. Those are things that are all connected devices, especially in the view of the FDA. And so the biggest question about like why is connected devices its own category? And the biggest reason is because they're really hard. They have a ton of moving pieces. Traditional devices, it's everything inside the box. It's this bounded problem. And connected devices break that mold. They reach all the way outside. And that's the primary reason to care is because there's a ton of new areas for risk for connected devices. They have a bunch of categories of risk that are not present with traditional devices, above and beyond those risks. And sometimes they can be substantial risks that you're taking on in addition. And so the question I get a lot from regulatory people is how do I know if my device is connected? As non-technical people, some of these things that are really obvious to technical folks are not obvious to people who are not experts in the areas. And so, what I want you to listen for is when you're talking to people, you should really have your ears perk up whenever you hear things like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, Ethernet, or even people don't talk about those directly sometimes. They'll talk about, oh, it's going to connect to the server, it's going to connect to the EMR, the EHR, the electronic medical records, the electronic health records. It's going to connect to the network. We're going to be able to access it remotely or monitor it remotely. It's going to integrate with the hospital systems. Those are all things that you should think to yourself, ooh, this device is probably connected. And you want to go dig into that and understand that aspect because that's going to be a big area of risk. And so the one of the first things that we hear is we'll have the technical team say, well, it's not connected. Or like, well, it has Wi-Fi, but we're not using it. Or it has Bluetooth and we're not using it. If you have any of these functions, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Ethernet, USB, if you're not using it, remove it. Do not include it at all. And sometimes people will say, well, maybe we want to use it in the future. We want to expand it or have it in there. That's the same thing as saying, I want to have future risk with no reward today. You take all the risk and complexity of having this connectivity if you include in your product. And if you don't use it, then you get none of the upsides of having your product. The only thing you're doing is making your product more risky. You should take every effort to remove these functions from your products unless there is a good reason to have them in your product because they have a ton of risk involved. And so I want to take a sidestep here and talk about some current events. So there recently on March 11th, so about 2 weeks ago, a little less than that, Stryker was attacked by the Iran-backed group Handala, which is a Iranian-linked hacking group. And so this is a very recent development in how you should think about your positioning and the risk of having a connected device. And so in this hack, they compromised Stryker's central IT systems and they used them against itself to wipe out tens of thousands of devices at Stryker all at once. And one of the big changes that occurred here is in the past, there was a lot of cyber espionage, people hacking into companies, people hacking into uh, systems to get information, to maybe steal your designs, to steal intellectual property, those kinds of things. But this is a big change, recent shift. This is cyber warfare, and they didn't hack into Stryker to steal their IP. They didn't hack into Stryker to extort them for money. They hacked into Stryker to have an effect, to attack and disable their systems. And so this is a big, big shift in how cybercrime and cyber warfare have evolved, especially as this starts spilling over into the rest of the world. And so we're going to talk about this at the very end and how this should kind of shift how you're thinking about it. But I wanted to touch on it up here at the front, so you can keep it in mind as we go through the rest of this here. So the biggest question is, so how do these connected devices work? So when we talk about things, it can often be obvious and implicit for the technical team. There are a lot of parts of a connected device, lots and lots of subsystems that all interact differently. But very rarely do we see people sit down with the non-technical team and explain, here are all the boxes, here's how they go together. And very, very rarely are you going to hear, here are all the questions you should ask that people may not want you to ask because they're not going to have good answers for you. And I want to arm everybody with the basic knowledge about what are all the moving pieces, how do they fit together, and what are those questions you should be asking, the questions you didn't even know to ask, to help understand the system, the risks, what's going on, those kinds of things. So this is the most common pattern we see for connected devices, where you have your device, it connects to a phone, and then that phone connects to the cloud. So easy versions, like here, the connected pulse oximeter. You might have a connected continuous glucose monitoring device. You might see all kinds of connected diagnostic tools operating this way. This is very common, especially in the consumer space. This is how basically every device is connected. And so what we're going to do is we're going to dig into this step by step. The first area we're going to look at is the device. And this is one that's common across all the different ways of connecting devices. And so when we think about the device, sometimes people think about it as this one thing. It's just a big blob. And this isn't how I want you to think about it. Devices have, especially connected devices, have a couple of common blocks inside that you should be looking at and thinking about as you're trying to understand, how does this work? What are the risks? What are the implications? And so the first one we have is the sensors and the effectors. This is what your device does. Um, this is like sensing, EEG, EKG, sound, vibration, pulse ox, pupil size, everything. It could have an effector instead. Maybe it's a implantable pump, maybe it's electrocardiogram, maybe it's a ventilator, ultrasound. Without this part, your device is just a box. It doesn't have any effect. This is the most traditional part of a device that even non-connected devices will have, because they all do something. And so when you're thinking about this area of the device, the biggest question is like, what does your device do? Sometimes I figure out that people only have the vaguest notion about what this thing even does, and more importantly, like how it does it. It might be we sense in this unique way, or we affect the body in this unique way, or things like that. And having just a little bit of an understanding about what it does clinically and how it accomplishes that can really help you understand the risks involved. Another one is, what data does it collect? So if this is a sensing device, it may collect a lot of types of data, even those that are like peripheral to its core function. The next one is, how can this device affect the world? Which is a little different than what does this device do? Because in order to understand the risk, you need to understand what it can actually do. You might say, it relieves pain by applying a very mild electric current. And you're like, well, okay, could we apply a giant current? And your engineers might look at you and be like, well, sure, but just don't do that. Those are all things you want to understand to help understand the risk this device could pose. And then that relates in the last thing, which is what is the worst thing that can happen? And sometimes people can be not inventive enough about how bad or what the worst thing that can happen is. Um, you could have behavior that's like intentionally bad. We could intentionally have bad diagnostics or, underreport things or overreport things. You should cast a really broad net to understand this. And this is really important to understanding what risk could occur if you have a breach of cybersecurity. And so the next one is the processing and the storage. And this is, I like to call this is where the data gets turned into information. You might say, well, we have a microphone that listens to a patient's heart and tells you if it has a arrhythmia or something like that. And the microphone, the list, that raw data is really kind of the data, and the information, the secret sauce your device might be turning that into information, making the clinical outcomes, driving the decisions, those kinds of things. And so you're processing the information from the inputs, from the effectors, and turning it into the outputs. And this generally makes up the bulk of device software. And this can also be the opposite, where we use very special algorithms to affect the device and sense it, go back and forth, some kind of like advanced electrocautery where we're detecting the perfect cut on a vessel without overdoing it or things like that. And the other important part is storage. And so you can have a lot of different types of data or storage of data, things like that. The most common ones are just like the raw data, the readings, the settings. Oh, I want this to operate in this mode or this mode. But the next one is PII, personally identifiable information. Stuff like name, ID, birth date, that kind of stuff. And this can be both from the patient. Maybe you're collecting the data so you can link, hey, Jane Doe had this result on this day, that kind of thing. Or it might be from the clinician, where you say, oh, this is this doctor logged in on this time, or this technician, those kinds of things. And then the next area, which you're almost certainly going to have, is security information. So there's going to be at least things like keys, passwords, identifiers, um, firmware, those kinds of things that are stored on there. And all of these different types of data and different types of processing are really important to keep top of mind. And so the biggest things that you should be asking your engineers is, where is the thinking done? And so one thing is that sometimes devices process that data into information on the device, but sometimes this devices process this data into information on the cloud. They may send information up to get processed using magic algorithms, or using processing that's far too complicated to do on the device, or that you don't want to do on the device for like IP protection reasons, those kinds of things. And that helps you understand, where does this risk occur, where are the issues likely to be. The next one is, do we store any patient information? And this could be a pretty broad net. If you say, hey, we have to collect the date of birth or the year of birth to help, because one of our inputs or algorithms is patient age. Well, that's patient information. If we have to collect information on their gender, that's patient information. There's a lot of categories of information, and not all of them people might obviously think, oh, that's patient information, but all of those little tidbits can independently may not seem like a lot, but when you put a big list together, you might say, oh, we have a lot of exposure, or there's a lot of information that we could glean from this. The next one is, what security related information do we store? And this is not a common category that if you ask, hey, what do we store on the device, that people are going to be thinking about, but it's actually one of the more important categories of information. As you connect, there's all kinds of, keys, there's all kinds of ways we tell the server is the real server. There's all kinds of ways that we transmit data, that we encrypt data. Those are all really important settings on the device, really important bits of information. And you want to make sure that you actually know what all of those are, where they all are, what's going on, that kind of thing. The next one is the SBOM, the software bill of materials. And so the SBOM is a required element to be delivered to the FDA for connected devices with software. And the uh, if your engineers don't have this, then that's a really bad sign because, like I said, it's a required bit of information, and it's just as important as the rest of the device. If you ask somebody, well, what are all the parts of this device so we can build another one, and they said, oh, I don't know, that would be a crazy answer. And it's the same for software. You want to hear from this. You're not going to receive this document and necessarily look at it and understand it deeply yourself, but you want to hear from them that they have a quick answer, a positive answer that says, oh, yeah, it's right here. And it's in a place that people have actually looked. I think lots of people know the difference between documentation that people actually use and documentation that is there because it's required to be there, but may not actually be well referenced. You want to make sure that this is a well referenced document or that you hear from people, hey, this is automatic, this is generated, those kinds of things. That's what you want to hear about your device. And the last one is, how do we update this? And oftentimes we hear from people, well, we'll do that at the end, or well, it's not important, or it's not a thought through answer. And updating devices is another core function that the FDA requires you to have, and it's a core function for how we design in security. You want to understand that it's a use case that the engineering teams are thinking about, that people know how they're going to update devices, and that they know what that's going to look like. Because, for example, you might design a device and you realize at the end, oh, we needed a feature to update it, or we needed this thing to update it. And all of a sudden, you're doing more product development to meet these regulatory requirements. This is a thing you want to hear right from the beginning. And so the last part here is the transmission. And so this is the part that makes your device connected. And this can be intentional or unintentional. Sometimes you'll say, well, we use this thing that has Wi-Fi built in, but we're not using it. That's a really sad thing to hear, like we talked about before. And sometimes this is quite intentional. This could be Bluetooth or Wi-Fi or Ethernet. And one misconception we hear a lot is that these are only wireless technologies, like Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, those kinds of things. This includes wired technologies as well. If you have an Ethernet port or a USB port or things like that, that makes it just as connected as if you had Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, those kinds of technologies. And other wireless technologies that you may not think about as connected, like some kind of RF field that's used for implantables, that makes your device connected. Or if you have some devices use optical or ultrasonic data transmission, that makes your device connected. And so when you're thinking about the connectivity part of the device, you really want to ask your engineers, is this connection required to function? And, this can be a really important and subtle part because connections are fallible. They can always stop. And the next question is more pointed at that effect. Sometimes we say, hey, we have a endoscope camera that's connected over Wi-Fi, and that makes it easy and fast. And well, what's the risk if that Wi-Fi connection gets disrupted? I don't know about you guys, but I have my Wi-Fi drop out all the time. And if your patient's life is depending on that, then you at least need to take a really hard look at that area, or really consider the risks and design changes that might be driven by mitigating that risk or eliminating that failure mode. The next one is, how does this get it connected? And that's can be a really important part of the process that make it kind of forgotten in development, where you're doing the device, and in development, it's always kind of connected, those kinds of things by default. But all of a sudden, when it goes into the real world, there's a whole bunch of challenges. And getting things connected to a hospital network, for example, can be a weeks long process where you're working with the IT department, you're working with systems, um, all kinds of aspects. And there's also significant risk in this area. For example, if you have a Bluetooth monitoring device and you need it in an emergency, and oh, but first we have to connect it to our phone and get it paired and stuff. That's going to be a bad time. That's going to drive risk in your device. And this can be a flow that can also be really frustrating or hard to document. Um, and so these are all things that you want to do. If you've ever used your car's Bluetooth, and it's always been really annoying and frustrating for me, and I suspect for some of you as well. Those car manufacturers put millions and millions of dollars into designing those connected systems, and I want you to think about if your guys' development budget versus those guys' development budget. And that kind of tells you about, this is a tricky area to get right. And you want for sure want to make sure that it's out of the line of fire for any kind of risk or process in your device. The next one is can be connected more than one way. Lots of devices have multiple connection methods. They'll have Bluetooth and Ethernet. They'll have Wi-Fi. They'll have USB. And maybe your device is Wi-Fi connected. That's what you advertise. That's how you designed it. That's how you intended it. But it also has USB. Well, that USB is just as important for your security, for your risk, for your analysis, even if you're not using it. Or if you have Bluetooth and Wi-Fi, but you don't really use the Wi-Fi, same thing. Every type of transmission is part of your risk profile, needs to be part of the things that get considered in development. You really don't want to hear, well, we don't use this part, or, oh, well, that doesn't matter, those kinds of things. There should be clear, concise answers from the technical team about how they deal with these things. And the last one is one of the most important ones. Just did we reinvent the wheel? Lots and lots of engineers really love making new things. Making old things work is much more boring than making a new cool thing. And this is a trap that people will fall into where they say, well, gosh, Wi-Fi or Bluetooth is insecure. We're going to do our own different thing. And this should scare you. And the main reason is because, thousands of people on the planet, the smartest engineers in the world, built Bluetooth. Those same thousands of engineers, were attacking it, finding vulnerabilities, all kinds of little issues. And when you make a new thing, what you're doing is not making something without the vulnerabilities and the issues that come with Bluetooth or those other technologies. You're making something that has all that stuff that has already been solved. You just don't know about it yet. It's a common aspect where people see all the vulnerabilities and all of the work and stuff that has gone into it, and they miss the part that that's there because people worked on it, not because it's inherently a bad technology. And so this is a really good example about where this is. So this is the Boston Scientific deep brain stimulation system. And you see down here communication, Bluetooth. And some people are like, oh man, Bluetooth, that's like in my car. Do I really want that connecting, into my chest, into my head? That seems really scary. And this is much, much better than the alternative. Like I said, because thousands and thousands of the smartest people on the planet designed this protocol, attacked this protocol, and when you implement it, you see the vulnerabilities, you at least know the surface, exactly what's going on, and you have this pattern that the smartest people in the world have made about how to attack and defend this. When you see these older technologies, so this is the Ascent RF pacemaker. And so this pacemaker was designed with a custom RF protocol by engineers who tried to design something secure, but did not have all the expertise of the smartest people on the planet. And there were 529,000 of these implanted. And what happened was there was a security vulnerability in the wireless communication itself. And this security vulnerability required a whole chain of updates and changes to mitigate the risk in this. And as a result of this, I reviewed the FDA mod reports and found that there were at least 11 times These peacemakers were removed and replaced as a result of this decision, and at least 18 additional hospitalizations as a result of this issue. This is a really good example of why you should never, ever, ever make stuff yourself, because there will be issues. You just don't know about them yet. And if you hear people say, we're going to do it faster and better than anybody else, that should make you afraid.
Can I interrupt for 1 second, please?
Absolutely.
So we have a question. Can you please elaborate on the security related information stored in the device, perhaps with an example? And while you're thinking about that, I'm going to run the poll question if I can figure out how to do that. Let's see, polls and quizzes. So there's a short poll. Please participate in the short poll. Also, a reminder, I put a link in the chat for the handout. So please use that. Mark, you can just minimize this on your screen so that it's not blocking your view. Um, and if I need to put the link in again, just put the link in again. Please feel free to submit questions with the Q&A. And back to you, Mark. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah. So we talk about security related information on a device. I talked about a few categories a few slides ago, but one of the big ones that's top of mind is the security keys that you use to communicate with a server or with the connected device. Those are easily going to be in every single connected device. And that's one of the big pieces of information you want to understand. How does it get stored? How do they get in there? How do we secure it on the device? Those kinds of things. Just to help understand, give you context about that whole subsystem in the device. Let's see. So the next connection pattern we have. So when we're talking about this connection pattern, the next area we're going to look at is the phone. And so, people when they design phone apps, they think about like, oh, my app is the only thing this phone does, and then I don't know, maybe there's something else on there. But I've seen real phones by real people. This is the reality. You have your app is just a small part of all of these other potentially wildly insecure applications that run on the phones. Apps you haven't used in years. The apps that your grandparents have installed in their phones. Stuff that you should be afraid of. And when you're looking at this, everything else running on the device is a big security risk. Um, and the biggest question you need to be asking to your team is how do we manage the security risks of running on an uncontrolled device? Lots of, your app, if you're running on a phone, is not the only thing that it does. And all these other apps can pose risk, pose problems to your device, to your uh, to your app, and you need to really consider, hey, do we need to make any decisions or think about, how do we deal with the security of all the other applications on the phone? And if people, you want to hear a confident answer to this, there are lots of good ways to deal with this. But if people haven't considered this, or they're like, well, it'll kind of take care of itself, those are things that you should be quite worried about hearing. So, and there are a couple of ways that phones get used that you should try to think about. The biggest one is the TV screen. Uh, this is where the phones are just used to view device data. There's no control, there's no processing on device. These are things like Bluetooth thermometers, a pulse oximeter, things like that, where they're just like a second screen or maybe the only screen just for viewing data. And so when you're thinking about phones used in this way with your devices, uh, you want to think about like, is the data live? And what happens if it's not? There are lots of risks related to, well, we took the pulse again, took the heart rate again, and it was fine the second time. Well, you're really just seeing old data from the first time. Are alerts critical? So, and how do users get them? I miss alerts on my phone all the time. And if you're relying on somebody's phone going off for a critical or a life-saving alert, especially if that's the only way that that alert gets out, you should be really concerned about that. Phones are fickle things. The next part is, what parts of the phone do we rely on? There are thousands of models of phone in the world. If the more parts of a phone you rely on, the more validation, the more work you need to do, and the more issues you're going to have as you roll it out. If all you rely on is Bluetooth, that's already plenty. That'll have tons of challenges to get there. But if you rely on things like the accelerometer or the lights or the magnetometer or all kinds of things in your phone, you're going to start having lots of challenges in the real world. Um, the next one is, do we get data from the cloud or the device? It might be surprising to some of you that if you have a phone connected to a device connected to the cloud, that the phone is displaying data not from the device at all. It actually goes to the cloud, and then the data that you're viewing on your phone is from the cloud. This is how, for example, a Fitbit works. It'll connect to your phone and it'll connect to the cloud, but that data doesn't transfer directly from the device to your phone. It actually goes all the way to the cloud, then comes back down to your phone. And that might be how your device works. And so this is a good question to ask for you to understand the risks. Maybe you would say, well, gosh, all I need to do is get if we lose internet connectivity, it's not a risk. Well, it might turn out to be a risk because nobody considered, hey, this data is actually from the cloud. So the next way people use them is as a remote control. So this is where your phone not just views data, but you can control the device as well from your phone. Like a Bluetooth connected blood pressure cuff, or maybe you can start a measurement. Bluetooth surgical lights, where the doctors can tune the color temperature to their liking, or the brightness, those kinds of things. And when you're thinking about devices that you can control from your phone, you should be able to ask, what's the risk of not being able to send commands? Like, what happens if your clinician phones die or it loses connection or things like that? There's this availability risk. If there's no way for you to adjust your surgical lights, except from your phone, and the phone loses connection, you could have a big problem. Next one is, what's the worst possible message? Some people might say, well, gosh, we have this command to make the lights go into disco mode, but that's never going to happen because we'll never tell the lights to go into disco mode. But well, your device might not, but your attackers might say, oh gosh, we're going to turn the lights on and off and make them flash in a harmful and distracting way. Um, and another related one is there an override? So, for example, if you were to have something happen, whether it's a technological glitch or an attacker, can we stop the device? Can we change its behavior without using a phone? And this is a really important thing you want to make sure is considered, because this is an easy way to sidestep a lot of risk and a very common pattern for people. The next one is, could this cloud send a command? If you have a device and it's connected to your phone and your cloud, it's one thing if bad commands could be sent from the phone. That could be potentially bad, all kinds of bad scenarios, but it's way worse if you could have the cloud send commands. If all of a sudden your cloud can reach down to your device and cause things to happen, then you have this massive cybersecurity risk from people attacking your cloud, and they could cause bad things to happen on every device, everywhere, all at once. This huge change in risk profile. And the next one is, does the phone have special access? Is the phone that's paired different than any phone or selected phones? And so maybe if you could walk up and just pair to a device with a pairing button or something, and all of a sudden now I can cause all these bad things to happen, versus I need to connect to the device and enter a password or be an authorized user, that kind of stuff. There's a different risk profiles, especially in areas like hospitals where access is controlled, but it's not. There are plenty of opportunities for people to walk up to devices and interact with them that you may not expect. That can cause all kinds of problems. And so the next pattern here we have is the brain. This is where the phone runs processing for the device. A good example of this is Bluetooth is continuous blood glucose meters. A subset of these work by having processing on the phone that helps determine the dosing and the schedule and things like that, where it communicates, controls, and does processing. And so the biggest one is, what devices have you tested? What phones have you tested your device with? And if they tell you, I don't know, all of them, or it's compatible with all phones, that should make you worry, because that is not true at all. There are so many phones in the world, you will never test them all. There are going to be so many challenges with that. You want to hear them have a short list, a concise list, and physically show you all the phones that they have. They're like, oh, we support these 4 Samsung phones and these 2 iPhones, and we have them in the lab right here. That's going to make you feel warm and fuzzy. Next one is, what happens if the phone is too slow? So lots of phones will have lots of apps installed. They might be old. They might be challenged in other ways. And all of a sudden, if your device has a risk because your phone is too slow or the processing can't keep up, that's a big area that you want to be at least considering and thinking about and understanding when you're talking about how do you manage risk on the device. The next one is, what happens if the app stops suddenly? Um, and this may not be something that people strongly consider, but your phone actually kills apps all the time to manage its battery life, to manage what's running, those kinds of things. And if you rely on your app running 100% of the time, or being open or continuously connected, those assumptions are going to break down in the real world. The next one is, how do we validate the system? And you want to hear things from your technical team about real world testing, testing across devices, testing in all kinds of situations with different phones. You want to make sure that you don't hear, well, we have the one phone in the lab and it works with that. That's all too common when you start getting into the real world and bad stuff happens. The next one is, how much does the device do on its own? You can imagine, for a Bluetooth continuous meter, or for a something that takes action, if your phone is disconnected or it dies or it gets broken, and all of a sudden the device is useless, that's going to at least drive your users and how they change devices. But if this is controlling an important function, this could also be its own area of risk. The phone is not continuously available. And the last one here is, do we store PII, that personally identifiable information, on the phone? You want to really understand where PII gets stored everywhere, even if it's only transiently there, even if it's only there for a few minutes. Um, those are important parts in the chain of control for the device. The next one here is the courier. So this is where your phone just passes information to the cloud. And so, this is how, like I mentioned, fitness trackers work. Like a Fitbit uses your phone just as a stepping stone to get to the cloud. And, one of the areas is, what happens to data when we're not connected to the internet? So if your device is monitoring, for example, if that data gets lost when you're not connected to the internet, maybe that's okay if this is a device that's used for a few minutes in clinic. We're going to record some data and be done. But that might not be okay at all if this is a patient monitor that's continuously monitoring heart health for a cardiologist over 30 days. If somebody says to you, well, after 10 minutes, we start losing data, that's going to be a challenged use case for sure. Um, and the next one is, do we store data, and do we store PII? Do we pass this information along? Those kinds of things. There are lots of ways to mitigate the risk of passing information from the device to the cloud. You want to hear from your technical team that they understand if they're doing that. And then if they're doing that, do they have a plan, a strategy to handle it? You want to make sure that this is something they've really considered. The next one that's most important is how do we authenticate the device and how do we authenticate to the cloud? When your phone connects, it may not be connecting to the real cloud, or it may not be connecting to the real device, or your device may not be connecting to a real phone that's running your software. Every one of those links in the chain needs to have a strategy behind it about how that link gets secured. And you want to hear that your team is using some well understood technology, some very common thing to secure those connections, because those are going to be the technologies that are battle tested, the ones that people really understand and have really tried to secure. So I want to touch on some other device patterns here. Um, so we talked about phone connected. I want to talk briefly about what we call gateway connected, and the last one is hospital and internet connected. So when we say gateway connected, this is kind of similar to a phone connection, except we connect to a gateway, some piece of hardware whose only purpose in life is to bridge the device to the cloud. And so a common pattern for these is implantables that have continuous monitoring and reporting often work in this way. Infusion pumps can work in this way as well, for sure. When you're thinking about these devices that use a gateway, some device that's built for this purpose. Similar questions about, do we store data? Do we store the PII? Do we pass this PII through our gateway? How does this gateway authenticate the device? How does the device authenticate the gateway? How do the authentication of the cloud happens? What's the worst thing that we can do? Can the cloud command the device? Can the gateway command the device? Those are all risk areas you want to understand. How do we update all the parts? People may think about updating the device because that's clear. Well, you may or may not be surprised. Along the gateway is part of your medical device, because it's probably essential for it to function, or at least essential for it to provide some of its functions, like the connected ones. And that means your gateway needs to be updatable as well. And the last one is, how do we secure these wireless communications? Gateways are almost always wireless devices, and you want to hear that you're using some well understood technology, Bluetooth, Wi Fi, maybe LoRa or something like that. Something that people have worked on hard and that people have done technologies. They say, we have a custom protocol. Like I mentioned before, that's something you should be afraid of. St. Jude Medical has had to do surgeries on people because they made that decision. Don't make those decisions again. The last one is the hospital or internet connected. This is where your device connects directly to the cloud with nothing in between. And this is the most dangerous, most complicated, most security intensive pattern that you can adopt. When you see these kinds of devices, these are the areas that you need to have experienced teams with serious cybersecurity expertise. If you have people who are not cybersecurity experts on your team, you should really be worried. So things like surgical robots have this pattern, ventilators, infusion pumps, plenty of them are connected. And people might say, well, we're in the hospital network. That's okay. That's a safer area. The FDA's explicit guidance is that you cannot rely on the security of the hospital network. You should consider it just as hostile as the open internet. And when you see these kinds of patterns, the first question is, who are the security experts? And the worst answer you can get is, oh, well, the software team is taking care of that. Software engineers are not security engineers. Some of you, if you're in the regulatory space, might be like, well, the engineers are writing all the regulatory documentation. Like, they're like, oh man, it's gonna be a wild ride. You should think the same thing about software engineers and security engineers. These are different disciplines that require different expertise. Software engineers build things, security engineers break things. Do we have experts in securing internet connected devices? These are subtly different experience areas than other things, and you want to make sure that people have experience in this problem domain. The next one is, who is handling post-market security? So engineering teams may traditionally think about, we built the device, we shipped the device, and we're done. And then I don't know, stuff happens after it gets to market, but it's not important. Um, the post-market is the most important area of security. You want to hear that there's a plan with people who you can point to and name, whose job it is to handle security after you get to market, and not just, well, it's kind of their normal duties, but there's this extra stuff. This really requires people to think about dedicated resources that spend who are paid to spend time securing devices after they get to the market. The last one is, who is handling penetration testing? So penetration testing is part of security, where you go and you try to break into devices. It's verification of security. You might have lots of validation of specific security implementations. Does this work? Do we reject things? But this is really verification by an independent team, an independent party. Hey, my device is secure, is good, or isn't good, those kinds of things. And this is penetration testing is recommended at various levels. But when you get to this kind of cloud, directly internet connected device, directly network connected device, these are the kind of devices that are banner examples of when this is required and necessary for your testing. And you want to hear that there are independent people who have the requisite background experience in testing and security who are handling this process. So I want to come back to the talking about the Stryker cybersecurity. And so, we're thinking about, I'll call wartime cybersecurity, where people are not just attacking for, uh, where people are not just attacking to get information. They're not just criminals attacking. Hey, we're going to attack your network and we're going to ask you to pay us a bunch of money to recover, those kinds of things. When we have attackers who are funded by nations who have serious resources. They don't care about making money. They don't care about this proportional risk. They only care about having an effect. And so, in normal cybersecurity, security risk is proportional to reward. And in cyber warfare, we don't have this. People might not attack devices that are low risk or that are smaller, or that don't have much data because, well, if they're cyber criminals, maybe you don't have the money to pay them, and they're going to go hit a juicier target, or things like that. But in cyber warfare, you attack not to make money, not to do things, just to cause terror, just to cause issues. And IoT devices are really where cyberspace meets the real world. I'll call it meat space, where this is how you can have these virtual attacks reach out and touch the world. And the biggest area you should be worried about is an attack on central systems. This is exactly what happened to Stryker. They didn't go out and attack 20,000 devices, 80,000 devices individually. They attacked one system whose job was to affect 80,000 devices all at once. And what you should really be afraid of is somebody doing something like compromising your firmware update process. All of a sudden, they could push an update to every device in the world and cause harm. And they could cause harm in a way that you can't easily fix. If they update all of your devices, they can update them to reject updates from you. And all of a sudden, you have to walk physically to every single box in the whole world to update it to mitigate these harms. These are huge opportunities for risk, and a shift in the way that you should be thinking about what your exposure is and what your risk is. And when you're thinking about these kinds of questions, the biggest one is, who are the security experts? Do you have consultants who have at least evaluated what you're doing, who can tell you about where the risks are, who can help you with the highest priority, the highest impact things? When you're thinking about what's the worst thing an IoT device can do, you might say in a fusion pump, there are easy things. Hey, I can command my fusion pump to pump suddenly everything that it's connected to as hard as it can, as fast as possible. It should cause serious injury or death. But if you have like a surgical light, for example, Maybe it goes into disco mode randomly in the middle of a surgery. Um, when you could cause all kinds of patient harm and death, or even a lack of availability. If you have a hospital network that all of a sudden has to go to paper medical records, um, you can easily have patient risk, patient death as a result of the friction and challenges of operating a modern hospital using pieces of paper instead of the modern tools we have today. The next one is really important. Just do we have a response plan? Cybersecurity is not perfect. There will always be things, there will always be gaps. And the biggest one is, do we have a plan in place for what happens if these things happen? Um, if you are thinking about it for the first time as your phone is blowing up because something bad is happening, this is not it. This is not the time to be finding new vendors, to be trying to figure out what we're doing. You want to have these plans in place ahead of time. And those plans are not worth the paper they're written on unless you've tested them, unless you have tried them out to see if they work. Um, the next two are about these central updates. How do we secure the firmware updates? Do we think about these as the most secure, most important parts of our system where we should be placing lots of thought and care in the control? And what other central systems do we have? Do we have central IT systems? Do we have central cloud systems that can be compromised to cause mass harm or mass unavailability? Those are all the areas that you should be thinking to yourself about and looking into as you're considering these kinds of nation state risks, as we progress through time. So I'll leave you at the end here. So we have, I get lots of silly questions from people, that who they're afraid to ask their engineering team because they're like, this is way too dumb. So one thing that we've been playing with is, so we created this chatbot, connectedchat.marcusengineering.com, where you can go ask it your dumb questions about how devices work, how to connect to them. Say, you can practice talking to your engineers. It'll be much nicer than some of those people are. Or if you want to speak with a human being, you can feel free to shoot me an email. Always happy to chit chat and hear about your devices and what you guys are doing and how we can help. Um, yeah,
So
we can
we've
go.
also prepared two other documents. One is the 30 questions document, which we'll email to all of you later today. And the other document is the 10 cyber warfare questions that you need to be asking your team right now. And you can just forward that to your team and say, hey, I attended this webinar. It was really helpful for me. They suggested this. How do you feel about it? And see what they say. It'd be an interesting experiment. And so, yeah, and I'd also want to make sure that everybody downloaded the handout that's been attached 3 or 4 times during the webinar. Um, and please give us your feedback on that because, yeah, yes, I'll email the handout as well. Um, make sure that you get a chance to look at that. There are a few questions. One that I saw earlier was for home-based medical devices, the security risks or attack surfaces are considered treated lower compared to clinics, hospital networks, enabled devices, question mark,
Yeah, I
FDA.
think the home-based devices are not treated as any kind of lower risk. Your home-based device probably doesn't have IT staff that monitors and secures it. Those would be the same kinds of risks as a hospital connected network, as the open internet. There's no presumption of security anywhere. Is really one of the core tenets of the FDA here.
Hmm. So I heard a situation where somebody was on an aircraft carrier in the Straits of Hormuz and uploaded his went for a 7 mile run and uploaded his status and it gave the exact location of the aircraft carrier to the entire world. Or, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, the Strava attack, where it actually happens a lot, where people have uh, record their runs because some of these are fitness people, and they all of a sudden you see, gosh, 100 more special operations people recording runs in this base in this southern part of the world. Something might be going on. Or like you said, we turned on our run in the middle of the ocean, and this is the kind of stuff that military operational security people worry about all the time. um, yeah.
And there's one last question. Systems with components that store and connect internal FPGA to a central medical device processor. How vulnerable is FPGA technology? I don't even know what FPGA technology is.
So, FPGA technology, it's called a field programmable gate arrays. It's a kind of internal hardware used for processing, especially like Scott mentioned here in video areas, that kind of thing. And FPGAs, I wouldn't say are inherently more or less secure. They can let you make your own bits of hardware, which can be, just as insecure as any other things that you make yourself. And I wouldn't say that it changes at all how you should think about what you're doing, how you should think about the types of vulnerabilities you have. And you might even be more worried about it because you're building your own hardware. If you're not using other people's well tested hardware, you could be inadvertently making new vulnerabilities.